Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question. What does the United States look like these days if you're on the outside looking in? Let's get to the bottom line. Have you ever wondered how your country would look from a totally different perspective? Well, that's what we're doing today with the United States. Gun violence, inequality and race, far-right populism, America's retreat from the world, forever wars. Everything is on the table with our special guest today. He is Gérard Araud, who served as a French diplomat for more than 3 decades. He served as France's ambassador to the United States, the United Nations, and Israel, and he was the French negotiator on the Iranian nuclear issue. Ambassador Araud, welcome to the show. Thanks so much for joining us. Let me just start. You took this tweet down, but there was a tweet that you issued once that I found very compelling. It said, after Brexit, after Trump, a world is collapsing. And your response to that was, the content was right, maybe the framing was wrong. But I look at that and say, you know, that was a world collapsing. My question now is that world coming back?
You know, actually, I think I was right on the substance, but I was certainly not right as a diplomat to say it. It was not criticizing Donald Trump. It was simply that I realized, you know, on the 8th of November 2016, that all the Western world, the UK and the US, and I was thinking of my own country, was facing a global crisis. A rebellion of 35–40% of our citizens against the system. They consider that the system is rigged and they are ready to toss the table. And I don't think it has changed in any way.
Well, part of the framing of Donald Trump that he came in structurally was what he defined as America first. When you look at Joe Biden and his administration has come in and now they've taken the helm of foreign policy and economic policy, I guess the question is, it's America what, in your sense?
Well, actually, any country at any moment is America first or France first. You know, foreign policy is defending the interest of your own country. The problem was that when Trump was saying America first, actually it meant America alone. Basically, alliances don't matter. We are simply defending our own interest without taking care of what are caring about allies, partners, about history, and so on. So with Joe Biden, what we are expecting is it will be America first, but it will be America part of a community. First, the community of democratic nations, NATO and the other multilateral organizations, but also the US as a stakeholder of the humankind, if I may say.
You and I had a conversation with a group of people once. We were talking about American power, Chinese power, European power in the world, and it came up that power is often like the value of a stock in a stock market. It's the value of future expectations. And if you looked at the power of America and what people thought about its future, it didn't feel as robust as, say, China, where you look at, you know, China's future returns, what China's becoming, how it's growing, what it's going to be. China was getting a premium on its power today. How would you advise a government like the Biden administration to turn that around?
No, first, I do think it's very important on one side not to underestimate American power. I personally do believe that the U.S. will remain the first power in the world for the coming decades. You know, there are so many assets in this country, so much creativity, you know, from the universities to the business community. And the second advice would be not overestimate China. You know, really, I do believe that right now people are making China a sort of a monster, you know, which wouldn't commit any mistakes, which wouldn't face any problem. Actually, China has its own problems. First, a demographic disaster. You know, China is going through a demographic transition in 20 years that we went through in 1 century. There are social problems. Hundreds of Chinese are still living in an abject poverty. You have the debt of the state companies, and so on and so on. So no, China is not going to dominate the world. China is a country which is a powerful country, but really the US will remain the main power in the coming decades.
So as you look at what America would use that power for, if you look at things like Hong Kong and China gutting, the trappings of Hong Kong's democracy, you look at the treatment of Uyghurs, which the United States has called as genocidal policies against the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, and you look at these various aspects, and we've just seen the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, meet with the Chinese. At the same time, those foreign policy and human rights concerns are going on. China is an enormous trading partner of the United States and enormously involved with global health, climate change. I'm just interested because you've always been an interest-driven commentator in foreign policy. How do you get the equilibrium right between hardcore interests and then values you care about, whether they're human rights, whether they are how we work together on climate change? How do you get that equilibrium right?
Well, first, I think that the Biden administration will have to build a stable relationship with China. It will be much more complicated than it was with the USSR, because there won't be a bamboo curtain falling in Asia somewhere. Because first, you have the intensity of the economic relationship between the US and China, and there won't be a decoupling between the two economies. The second point is that most of the Asian countries don't want to be obliged to have to choose between us and them. And the third element also is that China is not an ideological threat towards the free world. There is no Chinese Communist Party in Europe. There is no ideological challenge. So it will be a complicated balance to find. There will be containment. There will be a healthy dose also of engagement. As for the human rights, it will be a problem, and the U.S. will have also to find really how not to go too far while being faithful to their values. I'm going to sound a bit French, a bit cynical, but I don't think that the Biden administration will allow the human rights issue to undermine a relationship as financially, economically, strategically important as the relationship with China. The Americans know, the administration knows that China is not going to change its policy, human rights policy. It's not going to become a Western democracy in the coming decades. So the U.S. will have to have a relationship with an authoritarian China.
Would you frame that in a similar way? When I'm listening to you, I'm sort of thinking of the relationship with Saudi Arabia and the Jamal Khashoggi issues, which were a big campaign issue for Joe Biden. He said he wouldn't deal with the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who's now dealing with it. But Saudi-U.S. relations are largely on track. They've gotten by that. Is that a similar case in your mind?
Oh, you can even go beyond that, because China is, I think, 100 times more important to the U.S. than Saudi Arabia. Really, and you have also a democratic administration, and democratic administration during the first 6 months or the first year, usually it's very keen on defending human rights. And after a while, really remember Brzezinski, after Kissinger, under Carter, and after a while, the administration is obliged also to take into account the cold reality of the world.
Ambassador, one of the issues you dealt with both at home in France, but also when you were ambassador at the United Nations in the United States, was our allied efforts on terrorism. Many people think terrorism sort of hijacked and distracted the foreign policy establishment from a lot of other threats. How would you frame those years that maybe are continuing in which terrorism, both domestically inside France, against the United States and against other of our allies, was such a prominent feature of our foreign policy and national security policy?
Well, I think it's a question, of course, for the American foreign policy, also for the French foreign policy. As you may know, we are deploying soldiers several thousand soldiers in Africa to find terrorist groups. But at the end of the day, like you in Afghanistan, the question may be raised also for the French involvement in Africa, since we have been in Mali now for nearly 8 years. Is it possible to win a war against terrorism really this way? Is there a military solution in our fight against terrorism? Or we may be doomed to spend decades fighting, killing people, and seeing other people taking their place. So I think what we could have with the Biden administration, and it's something that I do hope, will be the rehabilitation of diplomacy. Really, I don't say negotiation with terrorists, but simply going back to the roots of terrorism and working with local governments. You know that local governments actually are the first victims of terrorism. So how can we work with these governments instead of sending our soldiers? Because I think we can draw the lesson of our involvements. Simply, it doesn't work.
You know, if Zbigniew Brzezinski, you know, the former national security advisor to President Carter, was around, but a very prominent national security commentator, he would critique America's forever war in Afghanistan, or maybe what the French were doing in Africa today, as like relics of a neo-colonial past, that we have delusions of imperial grandeur, that we're continuing to deploy force, you know, indefinitely, driven more by inertia than strategic need. How would you respond to Brzezinski if he were sitting across from you?
Actually, I've been, you know, sitting across him, of course, because he was quite an impressive analyst. And in a sense, I share his point of view. I'm not sure that it's colonial hangover, but I think it has been a mistake to think that we can solve with our soldiers a lot of problems. I think there has been an excessive militarization of the foreign policy, first of the US also, of course, but also in a sense with France. You know the saying, if you have a big hammer, every problem looks like a nail. And I do think that it's something which could be which could be said of American foreign policy. And I rush to add also of the French foreign policy. We need diplomats, and maybe that we need less soldiers.
Let me switch tracks, Gérard, for a moment. You know, since you've left Washington as ambassador, you've become a very sought-after commentator. You appear on TV networks, people follow your tweets, and they come with a kind of insight and raw honesty about America that I think we're not used to, whether it's about race after the George Floyd murders, when it's about inequality in this country. And I'd just love to get a sense, as you look at this nation from an offshore perspective, and you look at these domestic issues of identity and tension and the divides in the nation, now made so much worse during this pandemic, I'd be interested in, you know, sort of your notions of what's wobbly and what's strong.
No, first, I live in the U.S. I've decided to live in the U.S., so it means that I love this country. And for me, again, I think I said it in the beginning of our interview. The fact is that I'm struck how the Americans, how the United States are facing the same problems in very comparable terms to the European countries, and especially to France. And most of the issues, of course, you have national circumstances which are quite different. The fact that the U.S. is a country of immigrants much more than France. But again, you have the rebellion of some of our citizens against the systems. And you have also communities which are, I think rightly so, which are really asking for the end of any discrimination. And that's a common fight in Western democracies. And my dream, frankly, my dream will be that the Western democracies, in a sense, work together, really admit that they have common failures and try to solve this issue or to face these issues. One common element that I see everywhere also in terms of the recipes, if I may say, is I really do believe that we are going at an end of a cycle, which means the end of the neoliberal era. You know, this end where you had in America, you had Reagan, Clinton, and Obama in a sense, and in Europe you had Thatcher, Blair. You know, this idea that taxes are bad, the state is bad, the market is a god. I do think, and that free trade is always positive. I do think that our citizens have been telling us everywhere, in the streets of Paris, like in the US, enough is enough. We have, in a sense, to change our ways. And what is striking for me is to see that Biden administration, little by little, you know, is shifting into this new direction, and that's, in a sense, it's quite exciting. And as usual, the U.S. are the first one to show the way.
You did tweet, I found it cute, that, you know, what's wrong with socialism? What were you trying to say? Is that your comment on, you know, broad redistributive policies, our healthcare policies, you know, this debate about socialism in America? Were you just saying, hey, that's what's worked for France?
Well, you know, every country has its irrational aspects. And in the U.S., the word socialism, you know, it's part of these irrational fears of the society. It depends what you are putting behind the word. Again, I love the U.S., and what I'm going to say is part of my love. For instance, as an European and not as a Frenchman, there is something that I can't understand, is that you don't have a socialized healthcare system. You know, your healthcare, to be frank, you know, I have benefited from the dedication of nurses and doctors in America and their talents, but it was awful. The cost, the bureaucratic complexity, and so on. So that's an example. All European countries have a socialized healthcare system. It costs less, much less, actually. You are spending 17% of your GDP on health. We are spending 11%. That's a good example where actually socialism, quote unquote, you know, quote unquote, because even the UK, which is not really a socialist country, has a socialized healthcare system. So that would be a good example where socialism, whatever you call it, is not that bad.
One of the other areas I like to turn to is Iran. You dealt with Iran so closely, and I think, you know, again, going back to the Henry Kissingers, to Brent Scowcrofts, to the Zbigniew Brzezinskis, they would often talk about states having defining challenges. You know, there are a lot of challenges out there, but sometimes certain challenges are very large and defining for that era. I sort of feel like China is one. Iran may be another. I'd love to get your insights into that, because right now we've gone through a whiplash where the Obama administration negotiated, along with the French, along with the British, along with the P5+1, the JCPOA, the joint plan on Iran's nuclear program. Donald Trump took the United States out of that. Now there are questions on going back in. What are your insights, not only as an observer of the U.S. side of that, but of Iran's game in this?
To be frank, I'm quite worried. I've always, you know, again, the nuclear deal with Iran was a compromise, and it was supposed only to handle the nuclear issue. I think that one of the mistakes of the Obama administration in 2015 was not immediately after this deal to address the other issues of concern raised by the Iranian behavior, terrorism, missiles, ballistic activities, and also the regional activities. So Trump went out of the agreement, and now the question is how to go back to it. And it's not easy, because the Iranians feel aggrieved. The Iranians, and rightly so in a way, the Iranians are entering a presidential campaign, And on the American side, it's not possible either simply to go back to the agreement because the U.S. can't ignore the worries, the concerns expressed by the Gulf monarchies and by Israel. They can't also ignore the other issues of concerns I was referring to. So it's a very complicated equation. And I'm not sure that actually both sides will succeed to go back to the negotiation table. For a lot of Iranians now, they may be able to say, why are we going to make concessions to the U.S. if in 2024 Trump is back and will inflict us new sanctions? So it's one of these very, very difficult issues where diplomacy is key. And you may know that actually Europeans are trying to be the go-between between Tehran and Washington. But we are, to be frank, we are at the mercy of an incident. There are radicals on both sides, and especially on the Iranian side, who are ready to try to derail any idea of a new deal. Because in Iran, of course, the US is the symbol, in a sense, of the revolution. The anti-Americanism is the symbol of the revolution.
One of the questions I have about France, Germany, a lot of our allies in the world, is that they saw America sort of, kick them in the teeth in the last few years and hug a lot of complicated people like Duterte in the Philippines, Kim Jong-un in North Korea. What is the state of the relationship out there? We've seen President Macron talk about the need for a European defense capacity that is driven by Europeans and not the Americans. I'm interested in whether or not those sets of relationships are now entering a new phase, or whether you think they can snap back into the kind of the close coordination and the mutual trust that used to be.
Unfortunately, I think that most of Europeans are in a denial. Basically, their dream is simply, as you said, to snap back. Because for Europeans, in a sense, the American leadership is quite comfortable. And if the Europeans were following Macron, the French president saying we need to have some European strategic autonomy, what does it mean in concrete terms for Europeans? For Eastern European countries, really like Poland or the Baltic states, it would mean that they would be worried about losing the American military guarantee. And you can understand, seen from this country with their tragic history and with the Russian behavior, that they can be rightly worried, and they prefer to have the military guarantee to the French or the British guarantee. As for countries like Germany, Italy, and Spain, which are spending between 1% and 1.4% of their GDP on defense, European strategic autonomy would mean more money, spending more money on defense. So having a Biden administration, having such a friendly administration towards Europe, I think it's a comfortable pretext or alibi for the Europeans to tell Macron and to tell the French, oh, as usual, you are a pain. Let's go back to business as usual.
Well, Gérard Araud, former ambassador of France to the United States, we really appreciate your candor and fascinating perspectives on today's America. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Steve. Bye-bye.
So what's the bottom line? It's always fascinating to hear how the rest of the world looks at the United States. The 4 years of the Trump administration's America First policies really did turn the world upside down. Today, nations have serious doubts about American leadership. Many people around the world would like to go back to the good old days, but what's done can't be undone. China and Iran will be skeptical about working with Washington on long-term stuff, knowing that the next president could shred everything up again. My guest was right. It would be great if the United States and its allies could become cold-eyed about their interests and priorities and set aside their delusions and distractions and help build a more stable world. But let's face it, delusions and distractions almost always beat reality. And that's the bottom line.